Hi dear friends and cultural creators, Bruce Lipton here. I have a story that I believe today is one of the most important stories for life on this planet. And it has to do with the crisis. And you say, crisis? What crisis? Well, all you have to do is every day open up the newspaper and there before you, one crisis after the other. Whether it's an economic or violence or religious, racial crisis, they go on and on and on. So you say, well, which crisis? And I say, actually, those are not the real crises that we should be focusing on. What we should be focusing on is an evolutionary crisis. You go, evolutionary crisis? And I go, yes. Here's a story. Let's go back to 1970. In 1970, there was an assessment by the World Wildlife Foundation of how many animals were on this planet. And recently, just 2 years ago, they redid this assessment, and guess what they found? 2/3 of all the animals on this planet have now disappeared since 1970. In addition, people who are working with marine organisms have come up with an understanding that by 2048, there'll be no fish in the ocean. We've overfished the population, we're destroying the breeding grounds, and we're also polluting the sea to such an extent that we're causing a wipeout of the fish in the ocean. Recently in Germany, after 20 years of an assessment on insects in their national parks, they found now that 75% of the insects are gone since 20 years. Well, you look around, you say, yes, the insects are going, the animals are going, the fish are going, and guess what? NASA in the United States, with a rigorous scientific assessment, recognizes that civilization as we know it is facing an irreversible collapse within the next couple of decades. So all of this comes to a very important understanding, and that is this. The crisis we're facing is a crisis that implies that we must evolve. Crisis ignites evolution, meaning the way we are going, we are actually destroying the planet. And the significance is profound because in the history of this planet, 5 times life was thriving on this planet, and some catastrophic event, such as a comet hitting the Earth or tectonic plate movements, have caused from 70 to 95% of life to disappear on this planet. These are called mass extinctions. Well, the 5 previous mass extinctions happened before humans were even on this planet. But guess what? Science has now recognized we are fully into what is called the 6th mass extinction of life. But more important in this story is the fact that this extinction is not from natural causes. This extinction is actually being provoked by human behavior. Humans are destroying the environment without recognizing that we are part of that environment. When the environment goes, so do we. And so, in fact, we are facing human extinction. And we're not talking 1,000 years from now. We're talking within the century that human life could be wiped out on this planet. So, we must evolve. Why evolve? Simple point. You can't keep moving in the same direction that's causing the problem. Human behavior is causing the problem. So that means human behavior must change to accommodate an opportunity to survive into the future. And this is where the interesting story of evolution is coming from. If we go back to our understanding of evolution, it really comes from the popular form from Charles Darwin in 1859, when he wrote his very important book called On the Origin of Species. In this book, it comes down to the fact that hereditary factors are responsible for the characteristics of life. And that in his story of evolution, that evolution occurs when genes change, the hereditary factors, and as these changes occur, nature will select the changes that improve the race, and nature will eliminate those people or organisms with mutations that are less effective in survival. So it's called natural selection. After a mutation, nature will select the most viable of the mutants to continue the species line. So this is how we perceive of evolution, that there must be some change in our genetics. Well, then to understand that, in 1895, Ernst Haeckel, a very famous biologist, created the tree of life as we know it. It's a tree of evolution. And really what it represents is at the bottom of the tree, at the base of the tree, is the most primitive organisms. And as you go up the tree, you get more and more and more complex organisms until you hit humans at the top. So bacteria are found at the bottom of the evolutionary tree, and through continuous evolution, bacteria led to humans, which are presumably at the top of this evolutionary tree. So when we look at it and we try to understand, so what is evolution based on? We go back to Darwin and say, genes provide for the characteristics. So all of a sudden they started to recognize that the more complex an organism, it must have more complex genes. So we started to recognize that evolution is increasing complexity through increasing genetics. And therefore we have a metric to measure evolution. Let's measure the genes. Well, the first and important fact is this. In 1944, it was recognized that genes are blueprints to make the proteins of the body. And there are over 100,000 proteins. Well, immediately scientists said, well, in a human with over 100,000 proteins, and each protein requiring a gene, it would be obvious that the human genome will have over 100,000 genes in the genome. And so when the Genome Project got off the ground, that was what the intended conclusion would be. Humans, with their great complexity, would have greater than 100,000 genes. So if we go back and look at the history of the Genome Project, it didn't start with humans. They started with more primitive organisms. And the most primitive organism they looked at is a little tiny worm called Caenorhabditis elegans. This worm is so small, it's less than 0.5 millimeter in length. And it has 1,271 cells. So it was a good starting point because they said they studied the behavior of this worm, and they figured if they could understand the genes in this little tiny worm, they would be able to connect the genes to behavior. So the first project to identify a genome, which is the complete set of genes in an organism, was to look at the genes in Caenorhabditis elegans. The 1,271 cell organism has about 20,000 genes. Well, if you go up the evolutionary tree, there's more complexity, and presumably there are more genes. So the next organism that scientists pursued to understand the genome was called the fruit fly, the Drosophila. That has been studied by behaviorists and geneticists for years. It was a good candidate to see how many genes would be in that more complex organism than the worm. And here's the surprise. The fly, which is infinitely more complex than Caenorhabditis elegans, has only 17,000 genes. Well, this threw a monkey wrench in the game because the thought was as you go up the evolutionary tree, there's going to be more genes. And yet, the more complex fruit fly has less genes than the simple Caenorhabditis elegans worm. But that didn't stop them because the prize was to look at the human genome. And finally, around 2001, the results of the Genome Project started coming in. And what did we find? After all that research, we found that there are only about 20,000 genes in the human genome. Amazing! Humans have as many genes as the simple 1,271 cell Caenorhabditis elegans worm, and yet humans have 50 trillion cells. The big monkey wrench is, as you went up the evolutionary tree, there was not greater complexity in the genes. Significance is this: then genes are not a good metric, a way of measuring evolution. So we said, well then what is it that we can resolve about evolution? What is different as you go up the tree? Well, very interesting story, and it goes back to a very important fact that people don't recognize. Darwin was not the first one to write a scientific theory of evolution. Actually, 50 years before Darwin, a scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck wrote the first scientific theory of evolution in 1809, 50 years before Darwin's theory. And what's interesting about Lamarck's theory, when he saw the increasing in complexity as he go up the evolutionary tree, he said it was really a complexity of the nervous system, that more primitive organisms had a very simple nervous system, and as you go up the tree, the nervous system gets more and more complex. Wow, now all of a sudden it says, what is evolution based on? Well, the action of the nervous system, and the nervous system is consciousness. Now, consciousness is simply defined as an awareness of the environment where an organism can be aware and make a response to changing environment. So, guess what? Most primitive organism, bacterium, is already conscious. Why? It reads the environment in which it lives and can adjust itself and its genetics to accommodate that environment. So that means the bacterium is directly connected to reading and responding to the environment, which then by definition, bacteria are conscious. So we want to measure consciousness. And I say, well, how do we do that? And you can say, well, you can measure the size of the brain. I go, no, that's not really how it works. Because we have to go back and say, what is the actual unit of consciousness? Well, very importantly, research that I started back in 1967 started to reveal that the environment was adjusting the genetics and the behavior of the organism. And to understand how that worked, my research led to the study of the cell membrane, the skin of the cell. Not the genes. The genes are in the nucleus, but genes are reproduction. So the nucleus isn't the brain. The nucleus, by definition, is the gonad of the cell because it carries out reproduction of the proteins and of the organism. So rather than looking at the genes and the nucleus as the gonad, we want to look at the brain. And the brain, it turns out through my research, happens to be the skin of the organism. Very good reason. The skin is the interface between the environment on the outside and the biology on the inside. So my research started to look at the nature of how information in the environment is translated by the cell into consciousness. Well, this led me to looking in the structure of the cell membrane. And this is a whole new science that evolved from this insight called epigenetics. Because what did it find? It found that the cell membrane, although very primitive looking in the electron microscope as just a black, white, black little simple layer over the surface, this primitive little structure, as least primitive as perceived by conventional biologists, would say, oh, the function of the membrane is nothing more than like plastic wrap to hold the contents of the cell because it was so simple in its structure. But as I went deeper into the structure of the cell membrane, in that simplicity was something very elegant. One night, as I was trying to describe the cell membrane in a new understanding, I came up with a definition that blew my mind and changed my world. The definition of the cell membrane I wrote that night was that the cell membrane is a crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. What blew my mind is after writing that description of the cell membrane, I recognized I had read that description elsewhere and then looked in a simple book, Understanding Your Microprocessor. That was because I just got my first computer and I wanted to know how it worked. And this little simple book about the microprocessor, right in the introduction, gave the definition of a computer chip. It is a crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. At first I thought, how amusing. The definition of the computer chip and the definition of the cell membrane were exactly the same. But as I started to look at the molecular structure, I started to recognize that the cell membrane is not like a chip. The cell membrane actually is a carbon-based chip with the same characters, functions, and mechanisms that are found in a silicon chip. And as I started to look into that membrane, I started to recognize the units that would convert an environmental signal into a biological response. So as I looked into the structure of the membrane, what I found was simply this. There are proteins called receptors, and there are proteins called effectors. The difference? Receptor, as the name implies, receives a signal. An effector is a protein that translates the signal picked up into a behavioral response. It's simply an input-output device. A receptor has an antenna, and it reads environmental signals, and when that signal is read, the receptor couples to the effector protein, which in turn generates a biological behavior connected to that signal. So it's a switch. These structural proteins called receptor-effector proteins are switches that read signals from the environment and adjust the biology and the genetics inside the cell. So I said, well, what's the nature of the switch? Well, as I mentioned, the first protein is called a receptor. The second is called an effector, and the most common one is actually called a channel protein. So I say, okay, what is the definition of the proteins as biologists said? And I would give you the name that the protein switch is called a receptor effector integral membrane protein complex. Okay, I know that's very complicated, so let's simplify it. I'm going to simplify it in this way. I'll define the role of each of the proteins. The function of the receptor is awareness of the environment. Now, interestingly, just like cells, we have receptors too. And just like cells, our receptors are built into our skin. Eyes, ears, nose, taste, touch, pain, temperature, pressure, they're all built into our membrane, our skin. So cells and people share the same response. We read the environment through our receptors. Cells read the environment through their protein receptors. So receptor, awareness of the environment. Channel is a protein that translates the environmental signal into biological behavior by sending a sensation, a physical signal, such as charged ions, into the cell. So the function of the channel is physical sensation, a response after reading the environment, physically sending a signal into the cell. And so I say, what's the definition of the cell membrane in those terms? It's simply this: awareness of the elements of environment through a physical sensation. Now here's the surprising part. That definition is already a character of a word that most people understand. That word is called perception. So in the dictionary, when you look up the word perception, the definition is awareness of the elements of environment through a physical sensation. And all of a sudden I stood back and said, oh my goodness, the receptor effector proteins are units of perception. That consciousness is built out of complexes of perception. So for the first time, we have a physical unit that we can correlate with consciousness. One of these switches, the receptor effector switches, the membrane proteins. So all of a sudden I say, wait, now we can measure consciousness by how many of these receptors are built into the cell membrane. Well, since the receptor size and the protein size, the effector protein, are the same thickness of the membrane, it becomes a very interesting fact. If you want to put perception units, these proteins, into the cell membrane, you can't stack them on top of each other because the membrane is the same thickness as the proteins. You can only layer the proteins in side by side. So in a visual image, consider this: a bread and butter sandwich is like a membrane, and you put olives inside that sandwich, and the olives are the proteins. And the relevance about that is very simple, is that the olives can only be in a monolayer. You can't stack them up on top of each other. So all of a sudden it says, wait a minute, the number of perception units is related to how much surface area they take up in the membrane. Now we can translate the membrane into surface area, where the surface area is proportional to the number of perception units. And when you do that, it's like, oh my goodness, consciousness is due to the number of perception units, but the number of perception units, by definition, is defined as how much surface membrane exists. And now we can measure consciousness by directly measuring membrane surface area. And as we start to do that, and we go back to the very primitive organisms on this planet, bacteria, what we start to recognize is a very important point, and that is simply this. Bacteria are like invertebrate organisms. Invertebrates have their skeleton on the outside, as compared to vertebrates such as humans, which have a skeleton on the inside. The bacteria are the invertebrate form of life because they have a capsule, the equivalent of a skeleton outside. And you say, so what? And I go, the capsule will only allow the bacterial cell to reach a certain size. The bacterial cell can't grow. It has to be confined inside the capsule. Well, once you confine it inside the capsule, guess what? You could only put so much membrane inside under the capsule. And then you fill up the surface area of that bacterial cell. But in fact, even the bacterial cell can increase the membrane by making folds inside, called mesosomes, which are just folded membrane, extra membrane. I go, extra membrane is more consciousness. But again, it reaches a limitation. you can only put so much membrane in a bacterium. And then I said, well, what happens? I said, well, if evolution is increasing surface area and membrane, and you limited the size of the membrane because of the bacterial capsule, evolution would end. It would end with the most advanced bacterium you could have. And I go, why? Because you can't add any more membrane, no more perception units. But it's interesting because evolution then took a different tact. It went a different way. Once you made the smartest bacterium, guess what happened? The bacteria started to congregate into community. And the community of bacteria surrounded themselves with a big membrane. This is called a biofilm. And I say, well, what's inside? And I say, 50, 100, 1,000 bacteria are all inside. I say, yeah, but what about them? I say, well, they're different bacteria having different functions, so it's a community of bacteria with different behaviors. And I said, then what? I say, but inside the membrane of a biofilm, the bacterial cells cooperate. They make community and share the workload of that organism. So evolution started by first making the smartest bacterium, reach the maximum size of membrane. Phase 2, then take your smart bacteria, bring them together in a community to share their awareness, and that awareness was collectively called a biofilm. And then I say, then what? I say, but this is where evolution went back on another return to creating the smartest organism. I say, what do you mean? I go, the biofilm, which starts out as a whole bunch of different bacteria sharing the same environment, evolves into something called the amoeba. The amoeba is a large single-celled organism with organelles inside that carry out different functions. Well, evolution led the community of bacteria to integrate their behaviors. And the genes of all the different bacteria were put into one bacterium, which became the nucleus of the cell, carrying all the genes from all the different bacteria. And as a result, all of a sudden, one structure, nucleus, was able to program all the behaviors of an organism which was already surrounded by a membrane. But what was most interesting is, rather than a skeleton on the outside of the amoeba developed an internal cytoskeleton, microtubules, microfilaments, which created an internal structure for support. This allowed the cell to become 1,000 times greater than the structure of a single bacterium. 1,000 times more bacteria in a single cell because the membrane got to be very, very big. And so the amoeba is the next level of evolution. It is a new organism. And once the amoeba developed, the next phase was to make the smartest amoeba, creating more and more membranes to carry out the different functions of the cell. But now the membrane size was not so limited because with an internal skeleton, you can make the cell bigger and bigger and bigger. And so let's review evolution. First, create the smart organism bacterium. Membrane becomes limited, then bring a community of bacteria together, share their awareness, and create a new organism called the amoeba. Now the amoeba goes out and creates the smartest amoeba, and I say, what do you mean smartest? Why doesn't it just get bigger and bigger? And here's the problem. The membrane that has to hold the cytoplasm together can only hold so much mass. If the cell gets too big, the membrane can't contain it, and the membrane will rupture, the contents of the cell will leak out, the cell will die. So basically it said the cell, the amoeba, was like a balloon filled with water. If you take a balloon and fill it with a small amount of water, we can throw the balloon around all day. But if you take that balloon and fill it up with a maximum amount of water and then try to throw the balloon, what will happen? The membrane will rupture and the contents of the balloon will come out. And I say this is exactly what would happen if you make a cell too big. So guess what? Even the vertebrate-like cell, the amoeba, reaches a maximum size and can't add any more membrane. Then I say, oh, then evolution stopped again because it couldn't make a smarter amoeba. And I go, yes, it did, but guess what? Phase 2, the smartest amoebas came together in community to share their awareness. And so the community of amoebas became the different plants and animals that we can see around the world. A human is a community of 50 trillion amoebas sharing membrane awareness. And the more membrane that we have, the more complex the human consciousness became. But guess what? The brain of the human where the nervous system is contained, the skull, is filled with all membrane structures. In fact, this is why the brain is white, because most of the membrane is made out of lipid, fat. And so when you look at brain, it's white because there's so much membrane in there. Lots and lots of membranes from 1 trillion cells inside, creating a complex structure called the nervous system. So I said, so the human organism represents the evolved community of 50 trillion amoebas. And I go, yes. And I say, so then the next phase of evolution was making the smartest human. And that happened over the last few 100,000 years. And guess what? Just like the bacterium, the amount of brain nervous system you can put in a human is limited because we have a skull, just like the capsule on the bacterium. And if you look at primitive vertebrates, let's say rats, you see the brain is just a smooth bubble inside the skull. But when you look at the human brain, you see that there are folds in it called gyri and sulci. I say, what are the folds? I say, the folds are exactly the same thing that the bacterium did in the previous evolution, where the bacterium increased the evolution, making a mesosome. And so all of a sudden I said, guess what? The more surface area on the brain, the more intelligence. And that's why human brains are folded in such intricate patterns to fold all the surface area to make a massive surface area. The more surface area, the more intelligence. Then what? Well, just like the previous steps, we created the smartest human. I say smartest human, I say, yeah, you can't put any more brain inside the skull. It's a capsule, it holds it together. I say, evolution stopped with the smartest human. I say, no, you see the pattern is, first you make the smartest organism, phase 1, and phase 2, you take those organisms that are so smart, put them into a community and integrate their awareness, and you create the next level, a communal intelligence. So all of a sudden I say, well, this is a pattern that repeats itself. And I go, yes, it does. And I say, why is this pattern so important? Because if we review the history, first bacteria, make the smartest one, put them into a community after you made the smartest bacterium, that's called a biofilm, and that created the amoeba, the next level of superorganism in that sense. And then you made the smartest amoeba, and you couldn't make it any smarter because the membrane would rupture. Then what? Well, you put the amoebas in the community. And then what? You create the new organisms, the plants and animals, and especially for our discussion, the human. We are a community of 50 trillion amoebas under one skin, sharing awareness. And then I say, then what? Well, the awareness of the human is confined to the nervous system and the brain inside the skull. And I go, the skull becomes a limitation for even human awareness. And then once humans maximize their awareness, what would be the next level? The pattern reveals is community. And the relevance for this is, what are we seeing on this planet? We're seeing a time for a new evolution. I say, does this mean in a Darwinian sense that we're going to alter our genes and create new humans? I go, no, because evolution isn't based on genes, it's based on consciousness. And I say, so then where's the directive of where we're going in our evolution? I say the directive is to stop seeing ourselves as individual units in the world and start recognizing each human is a cell in creating a superorganism called humanity. And that means we must break down the borders and the barriers and the separations that keep people separate from each other, because then we're separating the intelligence. That it requires a unity in the planet. And this unity actually started with the evolution of the internet. The internet is what is allowing over 7 billion people to integrate with each other, that we can share a common voice, that we can share a common wisdom. And just look at the nature of our technology, how quickly our technology is jumping. You say, why, did we get smarter? Not as individuals. If you plot technology's rise, you'll also plot exactly underneath it the rise in population. The more people, the more sharing of awareness. The more sharing of awareness, the more intelligence the group. And this is where we are right now. You're seeing the world going through chaos, crisis. Yes, that's informing us that the old way of living in a Darwinian world, which is based on a struggle for survival and competition among individuals, is completely the wrong directive. That evolution is not the competition, evolution is the cooperation. And this is what we're beginning to recognize in biology. Evolution is based on cooperation. To do that, religious barriers, racial barriers, nationalistic barriers, male-female barriers, everything that separates humans as individuals must be changed in our consciousness. We must recognize we will only survive when we collectively come together and recognize each human is a cell in the superorganism of evolving humanity. That humanity is actually the multicellular organism which would represent the next phase of our evolution. And so when you look at the world around us and you see the chaos, then I have to tell you, I say thank God for a very simple reason. Because if we didn't go through this chaos and continued our human path, it's directly provoking extinction. If we don't come together as a unity on this planet, then our future is our ending. We will go extinct. So, when you look at the world, you see the chaos, economic, social, religious, racial. All that chaos is stirring up what? An opportunity for a new vision of life on this planet. An opportunity for us to let go of old stereotypes and start to recognize each human is a vital cell in this organism. Killing another human? That would be the same as autoimmune disease in a body where your own body is killing its own cells, causing a disease. So guess what? We must respect the life of every human and every living thing on this planet because it's all one network called nature. Nature's falling apart. We're causing it, but we're the ones that can evolve. We can come together, start to recognize that every one of us working in harmony on this planet will actually sustain us and bring us in an opportunity to thrive into the future, not struggle in the Darwinian sense, but a new conscious evolution. A spontaneous evolution is facing us right now. Why? Because time is very limited. So I hope you understand this message, because now when you look at the world and you see the chaos, we can say thank you, because the chaos is provoking evolution. And this is what we need to create that sustainable, thrivable organism called humanity.